welcome to this webinar with the Center for Congregational Song. This webinar is a part of our free series that we started because of COVID time. And so we're glad you're here, glad you can make it. If you're watching it live, welcome. I'll introduce our leader today. Joshua Zentner-Barrett is getting to be an old friend of mine. We've known each other for, I guess, over a decade now. Joshua went to Wilfrid Laurier for his undergrad in organ performance, then went to Perkins School of Theology to study with the C. Michael Hahn, fellow of the Hymn Society, to do his master's in sacred music with an organ concentration, and is now a theology student at St. Paul, right? Mm-hmm. At St. Paul, and is working towards that doctoral degree, but right now I think it's an MA in theology, and is the minister of music at Kanata. Did I say that right?
So yes, it's the right way to say it is Kanata, but Kanata. Out here in Ottawa we say Kanata.
Kanata. Well, that's the right way then, because it's it's your home turf, apparently, which is right outside of Ottawa. So he's the minister of music there. Joshua, thanks for being here, and take it away.
Well, thank you, Brian, for having me. It's strange to think that it has been almost 10 years that I've known you. Maybe not quite 10 years, but somewhere close to that, being in that world for so long. And thank you, all of you, for being here for this webinar. So today I want to talk to you to sort of talk about risk. This elusive term, that's risk. And I've titled this webinar, Risking It All, the songs that make us uncomfortable. And it has taken various shapes over the course of the last few years, thinking about our stories, thinking about the songs that we sing to interact with one another, to dialogue with one another, whether that's ecumenically or interreligiously, or even within our own communities as we're exploring challenging topics and difficult questions. So what I'd like to do to begin is simply to get us singing. And before I realized it was a webinar, I'd hoped that I would see you all and could get you to unmute, and we would take a risk together in this Zoom format. However, we can do this way as well. And we can just imagine a swirl of sound in the computer. So this song, this is Ta Rahir Na. It's an ancient Celtic chant invoking the Great Spirit among us. And it goes something like this. Ta Rahir Na, Ta Rahir, Ta Rahir Na, Tarnahir. Let's try that together. Tarahir na, Taranahir, Tarahir na, Taranahir. Tarahir na, Taranahir, Tarahir na, Taranahir, Tarahir na, Taranahir, Tarahir na, Taranahir. we might need the Spirit among us today in this webinar as we talk about risking it all. So what are the songs that make us uncomfortable? This might be a moment where we can utilize the chat function just a little bit briefly, just so I can get a sense of you as best I can and what we might be singing into together in this time. So the first thing I would invite you to think about is, what are some of the ways that song appears in your community? And here, community in a broadest sense, up here in Canada, community is not just our church. Our churches tend to be a lot smaller. And so we're also looking for the way that song weaves its way through our families, our neighborhoods, our secular community, our choir, our schools, as well as church, maybe even in our universities. And also, how do these songs make you feel? The way that these appear, is there some kind of resonance or something that connects you through it? What I'm hoping to draw out from you in some of your reflection is, how can songs make us feel comfortable, and how can they make us feel uncomfortable? And there's a lot of different pieces that go into this once you get into it. So the obvious one, I think, for many of us is language. Language is always a bit of a challenging thing. And so in my congregation, I often will teach a new song to my choir first, and we'll have to prep them, usually by doing this sign with my hands and saying, hey, we're going to learn a new song, and it's in a new language. And their eyes always sort of roll over a little bit, because they know that, oh, Josh is going to take them through some Spanish or some German or who knows what else. I'm just seeing all your chats popping in. And thank you for sharing these wonderful places. Bars, baseball games, on the streets, in the community with choirs, children's choirs and youth choirs, pride parades. These are wonderful examples of the places that we sing where we extend this song. Now, maybe some other things that we can think about in terms of our comfort level or our discomfort is around the familiarity of a song. And I see that someone put that into the chat, right? What is familiar is comfortable, and what is unfamiliar is uncomfortable, generally speaking. And that might be, it's a new hymn, but that might be, this is a new song in a completely different style, or it's got a different rhythm that we're not used to. The tune is a little bit unusual. Maybe the theological content is kind of unknown or foreign, or it's a new way of thinking about it. The last Thursday with my choir, we've been doing sort of Zoom. We've been doing psalm sings for Lent. So we look at the psalm that comes up on Sunday and go through it through different songs to try and dissect it and understand it a little better. And last week's psalm was Psalm 51, which in my congregation poses a bit of a challenge for some people. Create in me a clean heart is okay, but when you get to the line about I was born in sin, conceived in sin from my mother's womb, people's hackles get raised pretty quickly. And that takes us in an interesting place to an interesting conversation, because a lot of us look at that as sort of, or understand that through the lens of original sin, but can we have a different conversation about someone else's perspective on this, or its potentially original perspective? All of these things are ways of negotiating or getting a sense of who we are in a community. And all of them, I think, are ways of also getting us to think, how do we respond to what is familiar versus unfamiliar? For many people, what is unfamiliar, we don't want to go there. It's complicated, or it's hard, or we want to sing what we know. And so maybe we don't sing anything new. Maybe we're hesitant, but let's give it a try. And so we'll go to it with lots of teaching, lots of singing and practice. Maybe we'll ease into it. Okay, we've got a new text, but we'll use a tune we know. Or we've got a text we really know, and let's try a new tune and see what comes out of it. The piece that I'm always thinking about is, how can we sing in a way that we don't turn our brains off? Sometimes when we're so comfortable with something, we're not always thinking about what we're saying, what we're singing and internalizing. And other times, something new, something different, something uncomfortable can really make us think about, why did this make me uncomfortable? Or what do I need to investigate in this regard? So where I want to take you in this is, instead of focusing on this versus that, on divisions or polarizations, I want to take us down a middle path, one that grounds our singing theologically. And this, I think, takes us to two implications that we need to wrestle with. The first one is that we need to reflect a little bit, or probably a lot, on who or what or how or why, when, where, and so on God is. That's the theology piece, right? The critical reflection on God. But that's what leads us to our second implication. The way in which we glimpse God in this reflection may also give us a sense of how we are to sing to and about God. And this is what brings me to risk. So again, I want to say thank you for all your wonderful comments, which are bringing up a lot of great responses, but also some much deeper questions around discomfort and comfort and all of these things. And I hope we can come back to them in more detail towards the end of our time together. So to start with, I want to explore risk in sort of theological terms. And so that first implication, right? Who or what is God? How can we know God? How can we glimpse God? Probably a year and a half ago, before the pandemic, I had a really nice children's time in church with the children and youth who were there. And we were doing it on, I think it was Transfiguration Sunday. And I took a box and put a stuffed animal inside and cut a hole in the box and asked the kids to stick their hand in and tell me what was in the box. And they said, okay, I think it's a stuffed animal. It might be a dog. Maybe it's a horse. It was actually a sheep. And it was the moment to introduce to them the word theophany, right? This experience of the revelation of God. And the point of this was we never get a full-on picture of who God is. In the Christian story, the closest we come to that full-on story or that full-on glimpse is the person of Jesus Christ. But most of the time, we see sort of around the corner. We get little pieces of who God is. But I think in those pieces, we actually get quite a vision of what that looks like. And so a few moments that come to mind when we think about risk would be first in the Old Testament. My favorite one is probably creation itself. And I have to thank both Michael Hahn and Chris Anderson, my profs at Perkins, because as they were making us write our comprehensive exams, I ended up writing a little bit about this idea of risk, about God taking the risk to create the world, to breathe in to the first human being, to speak a word of creation, not knowing what was going to come out, and maybe not being too sure if the outcome was what was intended. And I don't know, throughout the biblical witness, I think we see over and over this example of trying something out or going for it without knowing what's really coming. When the three strangers appear before Abraham and eventually reveal themselves to be God, Abraham doesn't know that this is God. It's just three strangers in the desert who might be coming to take his land or to steal his wealth. There's when God hears the cry of the Hebrews, when there's the cry of their suffering rises up to God, and God turns God's self towards them and responds. What an incredible moment of transformation, of risk, I guess is the right word, of them putting themselves out there and of God then putting God's self out there. This of God throwing God's self towards Moses in the burning bush, saying, I am who I am. Or I've heard, and you'll see some in your Bibles, the alternative translation for the name of God is, I shall be what I shall be. It's unknown. It's always beyond us. And I often wonder, what implication does that have for us when we say that what God is going forward, is beyond what we can fully comprehend or grasp. And I think these things really come together in the New Testament, in the incarnation, in the crucifixion, in the resurrection. This idea of kenosis, right, is that the self-emptying of God. God takes on a vulnerable human person, or the flesh of a vulnerable human person, in order to reveal God's self at its most. To me, this seems like an incredible risk of what am I doing, or what is God doing to give up the greatness of God to become a human person? The vulnerability is something that I think is very key to this idea of comfort and discomfort. Do we allow ourselves to be vulnerable or not? And it is what eventually leads us onwards. The end of our biblical witness, the direction that we look towards as Christians is the hope of the new, the recreation. And I had the opportunity to take a course last semester on hope, and yes. And so we talked about the difference between hope as the world knows it and hope as theology teaches us. And in the world, hope is sort of essentially optimism, or there's a good shot that things are going to be realized. And so we have hope for it. But the only thing that's hopeful, or the only time that there's really hope in theology, is when there's no actual hope for things. When things are hopeless, that's when there's hope. It makes no sense, and yet there must be hope. And so my question then is, well, who is God? If God is self-revealing, if God is risking of God's self for us, for others, what implication does it have for us and for our songs in the world, in our communities, with each other? So let me take a pause and see if anyone has any questions at this point or anything I can address. We're going to move, I'm going to take you a little bit through a bit of my own experience with some of these songs, or with some songs, as a means of unpacking a little bit of what it is to take risks as a song leader. And what a great fun. I think you can all see a poll now. I don't want to suggest that what I will tell you, or the discussion that I will bring to you about taking risks, is normative by any stretch, but it is rather the goal is to bring us to a place where we are being self-reflective and self-critical about who we are as song leaders, since we are all song leaders in some way. Okay. Well, I hope you're all seeing the poll results. And I think I'm very glad to see that no one said they never take a risk with leading a new song. And I think, as we'll see too, taking a risk depends on a lot of different things. So it doesn't mean you're not doing it because you only do it a couple times a year. So you should have gotten a package along with your registration of songs, 3 songs in particular. So if you would turn to the first song in it, this one is Between Darkness and Light. And I'm gonna sing it for you once first, and then talk about it a bit, and we'll come back and sing it together again. And I hope some of you may know it already. Between darkness and light, I will always walk, and wherever I will go, I will open a window of light and will plant the seeds of love. I will open a window of light and will plant the seeds of love. So I was first introduced to this song during my undergraduate studies at Laurier, at Wilfrid Laurier University. And my professor there told the choir that I was in, this big community choir, in which we sang global song from all over the world, told us the story of this song. So the song comes to us is a collaboration from Israel-Palestine. The text is by Manal Hraib, who is a Palestinian woman in Jerusalem. And the song, the text came to her on the day of the Nakba, the day of loss for Palestinian people, which is the same day that the Israelis celebrate the Day of Independence, or the National Day of Independence for Israel. So what is experienced as great joy for one community is a time of great sorrow for another. And this song of hope came to her, and through a connection, she came into contact with Daphne Rosenberg, a Jewish woman in Israel who provided an English translation and wrote the music for it. And so these two women from two very different communities came together to create this song of hope and healing for a time of conflict between them. This song to me really represents what it means to be strong. When I started my undergraduate degree at Laurier, I was entering as an organ performance student. I figured I'd have a career in church music, playing the organ, directing the choir, that kind of thing. And that was all fine and good. And I joined the chapel choir, and we sang in the chapel at the Lutheran Seminary that's on campus. And near the end of my second year, I went to see the dean of chapel and said, I'd be open to playing services in the chapel if you ever needed someone, or I could do it when the chapel choir is singing, since I'm already there. And she very graciously said yes, but she also encouraged me. She said, we've just started an undergraduate program here in Christian Studies and Global Citizenship, and there might be some theological courses. We have a few sort of music and theology, sacred music courses that you might be interested in. And so it was Debbie Lou who introduced me to Inshallah, which was a community choir that she'd started many years before, after a trip to the Holy Land. And while they were in the Holy Land, one of their guests said, "Please bear witness to our story. Go home and tell our story to others." And the group traveling on this trip said, "Yeah, okay, we want to do this." And when they got home, they said, "We want to do this through song." And that choir grew from 15 people at the beginning to 150 by the time I became a part of it. And so I took this course. Debbie Lou taught this course. You spent an hour and a half in the classroom looking at global song and its context, and an hour and a half in rehearsal with all sorts of people from all walks of life in the area. And I went in saying, well, this is something that happens in church music. We more and more hymnals include songs from around the world. So I need to know how to do it. That's what I'll get out of it. I need to know how to do this stuff. And then I'll go back to my life. And lo and behold, I discovered that it's not quite so simple. I ended up falling in love with global song, with a commitment to justice in song, with being a little bit uncomfortable learning stuff by ear instead of off the page, with having to move to different beats, to singing in new languages, and especially of singing at all. I had sort of hoped that I'd be able to get through my church music career without really having to sing at all, and discovering, no, you're going to need to get out in front of people to sing, to show them, to be a little bit uncomfortable yourself. And I spent the rest of my degree at Laurier, the next 2 years, immersed into this song, starting to develop some of my skills as a song leader. And it culminated in getting to go to the Holy Land as I graduated, on this powerful experience, as guests of the Lutheran Church in the Holy Land, and to see the conflict, to see where Jesus might have walked, to hear the political story, to wrestle with the theology, to try and be in solidarity, to walk alongside others and hear their story. And all of these things, all of these songs began to teach me something about taking personal risk, about doing something that that puts us in a bit of an awkward place, but ends up transforming us as a result. And I think what Global Song, what Debbie Lou and the Inshallah Choir ended up teaching me is something that Mel Bringle calls non-lexical meaning. This is what I most appreciate and value about this song, is when we sing in other languages that we don't understand, and that don't necessarily have meaning for us, we might still be able to recognize that they have meanings for others, that they speak to stories, to conflicts, to suffering. And we might be able to ask ourselves, where does that lead? So if the first question is what we sing, the song of someone else, or even our own song that we did not know, and allow ourselves to be transformed by that. I think the second place that I learned something was how we sing. And so the second song in your package is My Lighthouse. And I did not know this song until I had just started at Kanata United Church. So this was in 2017. And the youth in the church went away to the United Church youth gathering that was held that year in Montreal. And they came back from it full of juice, full of excitement. They had been to workshops, they'd been to wonderful worship, they'd heard great speakers, they'd had great time with each other. And so they were invited to lead the service one Sunday. And they said, we want to sing this song that we learned, My Lighthouse. And I discovered, this is a contemporary Christian worship song, My Lighthouse. And believe it or not, as an organist who's been doing organ performance his whole life, contemporary worship music was not really my thing. Not at all. And I think I had been raised a little bit in, or sort of some of that maybe snobbery towards contemporary worship music had been cultivated in me in times that, oh no, it's not singable, it's too high, it's meant for soloists, it's too loud, the theology's crappy, whatever it might be. And so I looked at this and was freaked out, was really nervous about all of this. And in this, it was a moment of personal risk for myself. It was singing because of others. And in it, I learned that as a leader, as a leader myself, I like to be really solid in what I do. So I will frequently get up in front of my congregation when we meet in person, which we're not right now, but when we do on a Sunday morning, and say, okay, we've got a new song this morning that I want to teach it to you, or we're going to try this different way of singing, or it's got a different language, so I'm going to teach that to you. And always saying, we're going to take a bit of a risk together, but it's going to be okay. And they all smile at me and laugh, and then we do it together. But in my mind, that's okay because I'm solid in it, so I can take them through it. And here was a song that was unknown to the congregation, that the youth were going to teach to them with me. And I thought, well, I don't feel solid in this. I don't know how to do contemporary worship music. How am I going to be able to guide them through it? And I remember sitting with my colleague, with the minister I was working with, and her saying, well, you can't do that. You've got to just do it. You've got to take the risk and change your perspective on it. And the youth got up in front and taught them actions to this song. And we laughed all together and did a good job at it. But the point in it was not to sing it perfectly, or to make a beautiful sound, or for me not to make mistakes in the presentation. The point in it was to be changed through something else. And I think in this moment, I was changed in my perspective, and it was someone else teaching me that to me. Thank you, Judy, for that comment. It was a wonderful moment of being taught by young people. Instead of it being me that needed to teach them, rather they could be the ones to teach me. And I think this is something in the how we sing, right? This is how we approach our communal song. Is that it is a communal song, and that one of our great calls as song leaders is to give space for others to be able to lead song. Whether it goes smoothly or not, it's that wonderful moment that others can be up there and guide the community into this moment. Now, the third song I've provided is what I would say is the way that we sing. So what we sing matters. What we sing when we sing the song of others matters. How we sing it matters. And it's more than just being perfect or in time or with the right beats or the right organ registration, but perhaps it's with the the good actions to make us smile, or it's with the leaders who have come back from their youth conference and are ready to share those gifts with everyone. Perhaps it's a young student who's ready to start out, and this will be her first time leading you in We Three Kings on a Christmas Eve. All of these are the how of singing. It's not just the bones of it, it's the life that is lived through it. But there's a difference there between that and the way that we sing. And this is something about the sort of teaching of it, or the leadership of it. And I suppose these two things flow out of each other. And so the other song that I gave you was also a song I learned from Inshallah, Salam Alaikum. It's a Ghanaian text, but a wonderful song of peace, right? In Arabic, Salam Alaikum, may peace be with you. And so we sing this verse to one another. May peace be in your hearts. May peace be in your homes. May peace be in your lands. May peace be in our world. Salam alaikum lay. Salam alaikum lay. Salam alaikum lay. Salam alaikum lay. And of course, it begins with this wonderful call. Salam alaikum. And the congregation responds with a hoya. Salam alaikum, hoya. Salam alaikum, hoya, 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 hoya. Salam alaikum, hoya. Salam alaikum, hoya. Salam alaikum, hoya, 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 hoya. It's a great song. Great to do with kids. I love teaching it to my young people as they're heading out to church school, or as we're finishing off a service to get us going. But what I most love about this song is what it teaches me about getting out in front of people. So, as I said before, one of those things that Inshallah taught me was getting out from behind the organ or the piano, first of all, and then out from and away from the page. So musicians are often pretty well trained to follow the page. It's all laid out for you, and eventually you memorize what's on the page, but you don't move, you don't skip away from the page too much. And the songs that push us far away from there, where you don't need a perfect voice, you don't need to have it all perfectly figured out. What you need is a little bit of confidence, just a little bit, but mostly you need the will to impart something. And I hope what might be coming out of this is that the songs that make us uncomfortable are really about trying to impart some kind of connection or relationship between a leader and a congregation, between between two different communities, between two groups in opposition to each other or in conflict, between the West and others. There are so many different ways in which our song and our uncomfortable songs hopefully push us to grasp onto something. And I'm going to use here the word tangible, even though whatever we're grasping onto is not very tangible. We're going for connection, a tangible connection through song, even if there's nothing to hold on to at the end. But Salam Aleikum, as with any of these songs, is showing us something about the taking of the risk in how we sing together. And as a song leader, you're sort of walking a line between the risk that the congregation takes with something new or something challenging, and also the personal risk that you take of pushing others and also being pushed. I remember at the end of my first year at Kanata United, we were between youth ministers, and so the Children, Youth, and Families Committee came to me and said, "We're going to send some kids on a youth experience. Do you want to go with them?" And I thought about it and thought, no, I really don't want to go. Like, I don't want to sleep in a church gym on the floor for 11 days and be away from my home, and it probably won't be air conditioned and all this sort of the comfort stuff. But I very quickly remembered and knew that how often had I gotten up in front of the congregation and said, okay, we're going to try something new, and it's going to be a little bit difficult, or it's going to be a little weird, but it's going to be good for us. And so I thought, well, clearly I need to practice what I preach. Clearly I need to take the risk. And I think part of what this does is it will show up to the people that you're risking it all with as something authentic. You can do it. We will together push ourselves because they know that you're just as committed to it as they are, or as they might be. So all of this takes us to the idea of being self-reflective as a song leader. As for me personally, it asking, asking, who am I and what makes me comfortable? I know that organ music and hymns accompanied by organ make me comfortable. What makes me uncomfortable? It's a cappella hymns. It's having to create a cantor line over top of the congregation. It's getting different parts going and then somehow for them to stay the course altogether. But I also think about, where do I come from and what assumptions do I bring? I was raised in a Roman Catholic family in a very post-Vatican II context. And so the songs of Marty Haugen and Michael Joncas really speak to me as the songs of my childhood. And so I bring that kind of music is often where I go, along with a particular sense of how worship should unfold based on this Catholic liturgy model. And it's not a bad thing, but it can be a challenging thing if I expect that others are going to conform to that same model or that same experience that I've had. And most won't, and most shouldn't. There are other voices that will participate. Most importantly, though, I think is the questions that we ask. Very interesting question. Let me come back to that. Remind me if I don't ask this question. Linda, great question. What questions do I have about song and its place in my faith? I think this is one of the great challenges of who we are as song leaders. Whether we're paid or volunteer or up on a random Sunday morning just doing it once in a while. That there needs to be reflection both in terms of risk or of all of these things, in terms of your particular role in the moment in relation to the congregation or to your community, but also is there questions or thoughts about the relationship of those things to your faith, to that lived expression? And so for me, the question that really absorbs my mind is, as much as I love songs from the global church, I'm also cognizant of my place as a white Canadian man who is an inheritor of French, British, sort of European colonial attitudes. And what does it mean to sing these songs in the midst of that relationship of power between us? I don't know. I don't have an answer to that question. But I think this is a very important question for us to ask, for us to lift in prayer, for us to be in dialogue about. And that will have I think a pretty profound effect on my faith at some point, or has a profound effect on my faith and my understanding of my faith in that context. We also, though, need to engage or allow that our congregations, our communities engage in corporate self-reflection. That the decisions about what we sing are not necessarily up to a paid staff person alone. So we can ask, who are we and what makes us comfortable? I.e., what are our heart songs? I have these 2 hymnals in my office that my predecessors started, and every time a hymn was sung in church, she put the date it was marked. So I can go back and I have a historical record of the congregation. I can see what they sang more of and what they sang less of. And then when we do them, I can listen and hear, I hear them singing out on this song. This is a heart song. This speaks to them. And in just the same line, I can look out and say, ooh, we're doing this new thing, or we're doing this, and I don't know how this is going. This seems to be making them a little bit uncomfortable. And so all of these questions are based around whether we aspire to be something or someone as a community, as a congregation, as a person. I don't think song can necessarily take us there all by itself, but it is part of the process. And so to me, the idea of taking a risk with songs that stretch us in language, in rhythm, in context, in story, are all about helping us to transform the deep structures of faith. So not only our worship, but also the way we think and live and feel. And that is a long and difficult process, I would say, but a very valuable one. I've seen people, or I've really been inspired by watching many of my mentors and see that the relationships they have built over many, many years as they slowly come to fruition, because they have all been reflecting on these things and have been transformed. But it doesn't happen overnight. It doesn't even happen in a year. It takes 5, 10, 15 years for us to change and see one another and learn from taking that initial risk. All right, so Brian is signaling me that we're going to move into question and answer. And so if you have questions, if you want to go backwards to things, please feel free to put them into the chat or into the question and answer window. So first I want to address Linda's question that just came in. So she asks, do you think the risk-taking of unfamiliar songs distracts the congregation from worship because it may make them uncomfortable? And does that matter? So yes and no, I think. Yes, I think it certainly can distract us from worship. But I guess my first question in that regard, this would be probably a conversation we would have with many people, is what do we understand worship to be? Is worship about being comforted, or is worship about being pushed and transformed? My own perspective tends to be that the biblical witness is one that is always pushing us beyond our comfort zone. And if that is the word that we are hearing each week, then should not the worship or the liturgical practice around that also be one that pushes us a little beyond ourselves?
Would you like a conversation partner?
Sure. Brian?
So I'll push you a little bit more to lean into Linda's question. I'll play the devil's advocate. Worship, we should be giving our best to God. And so in that way, our worship should be well rehearsed, well polished. And when we purposefully take our people into these unfamiliar territories, and take these risks, when we fail, that displeases God, because we need to give God our best.
All right, devil. So
come at me, bro.
I think I would back it up and say, what does it mean to bring our best? So, and this is something that I have struggled with and continue to struggle with, is the desire for perfection. That in order for something to be good and true, it needs to be perfect. But and I should say that is a value that's often instilled into classically trained musicians. That sort of the measure of what is good is how close to perfect you get. But is that the same value that we need to instill in our congregations? Is the best that we bring to God perfection, or is the best that we bring to God something else? So, which I don't have an answer to that. I know that when I work with my kids' choirs and my adult choirs, to me, the goal is not making an anthem or a hymn perfect, but that's something that we have learned something together through that. So we've talked about context, we've laughed, they've maybe learned a new word, and we've pushed ourselves a little bit as a result.
I have found the Wesleyan idea of the different types of grace, and once you've kind of committed your life to Christ and been baptized, or wherever you enter into the journey, then there's this other type of grace that's constantly kind of perfect, like moving us towards perfection. So the idea of perfection is a journey, and so when you apply that to corporate worship, it's like you said, if we have progressed toward perfection by way of learning, then that is pleasing to God, because that's the point of this earthly journey, right? And the journey of faith is to move toward perfection, not necessarily to be perfect, but to approach it, or something like that.
Something like that.
Wesleyan
Yeah.
people would probably be really mad at me right now, but come at me, bro.
Yeah. No, and Mike adds in the chat about that music is also there, that church music has an edification or sanctification purpose, but it also has a pastoral function, and this is part of taking this risk, or of, I think, of being, or in my view, this is part of that pastoral function.
Well, that's the other way I was gonna kind of prod you and once again kind of play devil's advocate here. So, but Mike kind of beat me to it. I most certainly work with people. This shows up a lot in some of the more charismatic circles that I run in sometimes. This idea that if worship is about us in any way, that's a bad thing. That corporate worship should be 100% focused on God. So even the idea outside of the sermon, because often in these circles, they'll separate worship and the sermon. They'll actually call worship and then like the sermon, the teaching time, right? So like the teaching time is the time when we're supposed to learn and be challenged, but the worship time is about God. And that's when all the singing happens. And so the idea of like learning through song or failing so that we can grow together, and that this whole concept would really rub people the wrong way, because worship is supposed to be about God. So what would you say to that? And then we'll move into one of the questions that popped into the Q&A.
I think this is a conversation that I have sometimes with the minister I work with, of not separating out the sermon from the rest of the service. And so, but to see the whole service as something of a sermon. And I think I would use that in a very loose understanding. So that preaching the word or receiving the word does not necessarily just happen when we read the scripture and have it interpreted through a sermon or a homily. That it might also happen through a hymn, through a teaching time, through through prayer, through our offering, something like that. I mean, I think I would get into trouble with a lot of my profs for saying something like that, in terms of what revelation is. But I think there's I don't know. I don't think we can ever separate things from one another. I think that's we get into trouble by saying this is that and this is this. But if the Christian revelation in Christ teaches us anything, is that it's not one or the other, it is both. That the cross is both God coming down and going up to earth and relating to us side by side.
So what you're saying is when we get into trouble, when we remove the intersectionality of life and faith and all that goes into what we do as people of faith.
Yeah, why can't there be a glorification of God in learning something new about who you are? As you like if that is such a profound, if you learn something new that profoundly changes you, isn't that like, have you not gotten much closer to that perfection, or that grace-filled life of perfection? It's the paradox thing.
Some of the comments, and the comments in the chat don't show up on the archived recording, so I'm going to read a few of them because I think they support what you're getting at there. Hannah Kobe says, I think that when we're singing together in a way that makes us uncomfortable, we see one another in a deeper way, and maybe that leads to seeing God in a new way, which really leans into this idea of the body of Christ, right? So when we grow together and deepen our communal connection, by doing that, we also deepen our relationship with God because they are kind of woven together. Someone quoted Micah 6:8. And Debbie Ludoff says, might it be to the glory of God to see my own assumptions and be open to change for the sake of the other in whom God dwells. Lots of good things popping up in the chat, but I want to get to the Q&A. Someone else posted a question that takes a more practical turn. Edith Trope, I apologize for saying your name both ways, but I want to make sure I get it right. She says, what do you do when you have a priest who is completely risk averse and only wants to sing the oldie moldy hymns? I like oldie moldy hymns, and claims that is all the congregation wants to sing as well.
Great question.
Fix our problems, Josh.
Well, I think before trying to find a workaround to that is trying to understand this person as a person. So can we figure out a way to see what they are seeing? Why are they feeling risk averse? Why are they feeling uncomfortable? Or like, is there a theological reason? Do they have the names of every person in the congregation that wants to keep it that way too? I think it's really important to try and see things through someone else's shoes, and I am absolutely terrible at doing that. So I would, hold me to that, please. I think there's two things I would suggest. One is to be in fairly constant dialogue with your priest or your minister or whoever you're working with, and to try and continue to have a conversation, and maybe trying to find a different way of approaching it. So using kids is always sort of the classic example, but is there a theological reasoning why you would like to try something new for a feast day, or for a particular issue, or you have a reading about the body of Christ, and you'd normally sing one bread, one body, but maybe you have something else that you're going to say, well, this speaks to that text, but it also pushes us in a new way. But I think I would also say maybe there's ways of trying something new, of taking the risk without having to sing a song in a completely new language. Maybe you can take an old and goldie or an old and moldy, whichever you're going for, and do a creative singing of it. Whether, one stanza, the lower voices do a drone while the upper voices sing sing the melody, and then you swap, or you find out, can you do some kind of little repetitive pattern, a little ostinato underneath. Can, even if you just have half the room sing one stanza and the other half sing the other stanza, it doesn't seem like a dramatic risk. But if you're used to everyone singing in 4 parts or with organ accompaniment all the time, even if you do one verse a cappella, what a huge, like, that's a huge step. And I think that can go a long way for people to see, oh, I can do this. And then who knows, in a month or a year or 15 years, if you want to hold out, you'll be able to maybe introduce a new song.
What I hear you saying in both your chewing on the relationship with the priest in this question in particular, but then moving into your interactions within the congregation, how you would handle that, is relationship. And you mentioned to me before the webinar started, we were chatting, and he said, well, now I'm the minister of music now. His title had changed to include the word minister. And I think Mike McMahon earlier in his comment mentioned the pastoral role.
Mm-hmm.
And it strikes me that all of these deal with relationship, right? And really what you're talking about is risk management. So it's like, and that gets to Linda's question in the chat that just came in. It kind of brings us back full circle to her question, which is, how often do you think we should introduce an unfamiliar song? What I'm hearing you say is, build a relationship with the staff members you're working with and know your people.
Mm-hmm.
And between those two things, that gives you your answer of how often you should introduce or take a risk, right? You should know who they are, what they need. You should be discerning these things as a staff. Is that a good summation of what you're saying?
I think so. I think
I like to unpack things out loud because I'm an extrovert, so I have to say things out loud for them to even form in my brain.
I spent last week, I was writing an essay for one class about liturgical enculturation, and one of the authors was talking about liturgy as service. And this really stays with me as what your role is as a minister, as a staff person in service to your community. You're called to be a servant. And it doesn't necessarily mean that, your boss, the community, takes charge on everything. Sometimes your service will be to push them a little bit. But it more than anything, to serve is to know what their needs are, to recognize the spaces that might need to be filled or extended. I think that it's not a hard and fast answer to how often you do it. Sometimes I'll do a new song every week for a month. Sometimes I'll do a brand new song and repeat it for a month or a year, or however long. I think you're constantly weighing many different factors. Is there a particular pastoral need? Is there a liturgical need? Is there a purpose? Are they ready? Do they feel freaked? Do you want to freak them out a little bit, or something like that? But I don't think you can do it unless you have sort of enough poker chips in the bag, in a really nice way, like that there's sort of a give and take, or there's an authentic investment on your part, that you're not just doing it because you want it to sound great. You're doing it because there's a spiritual reason for it.
Well, Josh, we've spent about an hour and almost 20 minutes now.
And you told me an hour and a half was bad, so.
Well, we try to respect people's time, and this has been wonderful. Is there anything that you wanna leave us with before we sign off?
No, I mean, take a risk. Send me a message if you do something that makes you uncomfortable. I like hearing about that, and thank you all for your wonderful questions and reflections, and sharing your own stories too.
Awesome. Thanks, Josh. Folks, you've done it again. You've spent about an hour and 20 minutes with the Hymn Society and the Center for Congregational Song. We're so glad you joined us. Remember, we have one more free webinar in this series. Jonathan Hain from the Notre Dame Basilica campus ministry will be sharing a webinar on auditions and interviews, what musicians should know and what pastors should be asking. So make sure to check that out. We also have one more Hymn Society webinar through our paid series that will be hosted by our Executive Director, Mike McMahon, who has a wonderful panel set up to talk about where do we go from here after all of this COVID stuff as we see a light at the end of the tunnel. What should we be thinking about where we should be where should we be going? It should be a wonderful conversation. Joshua, thanks for being here. Take care, everybody.
Thank you.